Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from PistilWhip, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about sin, damnation, and the Atonement girl going to the Krusty Krab. As reported by Know Your Meme, the What Sin Do You Relish the Most meme started in April 2025 with this reinterpretation, in quotes, pretty loose reinterpretation, of a SpongeBob SquarePants scene. Squidward. What sin do you relish the most? Customer. Vanity. Squidward says, disgusting. The customer says, this face and this name are all I truly possess. And Squidward concludes, your death will be met with a tidal wave of total indifference. The original scene has a fish ordering a meal at the Krusty Krab. Squidward is sarcastic and dismissive of the customer's delayed and ultimately boring order. Relevant clip is attached, but probably a lot of people recognize this. You can look it up. Squidward says, are you planning on ordering today, sir? The customer says, I'll have, Krabby Patty, trademark. Squidward says, how original. And the customer says, and with extra onions. And Squidward concludes, daring today, aren't we? As is the wont of memes, PistilWhip continues, the format evolved to cover other subject matters. I find myself attached to the specific treatments of the sins sloth, greed, and envy, not because I'm guilty of those sins, but because I find the exchanges poetic. Yep, that's totally the reason. The evolved format has Squidward comment on the nature of the sin in the form of how blank, and goes on to describe the manner of the customer's downfall. I find this much more engaging than a simple dismissal. The attached thread has images and transcripts for the sins of sloth, wrath, greed, envy, and lust. The original example touches on vanity, but we're missing pride, gluttony, and, of course, gloom. Did you know that there were originally 8 cardinal or deadly sins? According to Wikipedia, the modern list of 7 comes to us from Pope Gregory I, which combined gloom with sloth, combined vanity with pride, and added envy. Therefore, Pope Gregory I may be the reason we have an American technology company named Envy, i.e. NVIDIA. And of course, we have Shakespeare to thank for the association of envy and green-eyed monsters, hence the NVIDIA logo, but I digress. Othello Act 3, Scene 3, of course, lines 195 through 196, O beware, my lord, of jealousy, it is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. What a deep cut. Future me will include prompts here if she thinks of them, but for now, present me will simply serve this information and let Captain draw his own conclusions, and produce content for the content machine. Hail Avaridia, capitalism. Incidentally, the title of the Parley is a spin on the subtitle of 11 Eyes, an anime that iPatch Notes mentioned in a previous Parley. Yes, let's take a look at some examples of the meme format. As is my wont in Parley, I will now explain the joke the way I would explain it. This is what we do here. We're not going to make a Checks Watch half-hour video on this topic without me, over-explaining the thing. And to be fair, this is a little bit of a weird meme format. Yeah, it's a little strange. It's fairly far away from the original thing. You know, it's not entirely straightforward to appreciate the value of this meme. I am happy you submitted this Parley. I find this entertaining. We can digest the 7 deadly sins, and as we know, there are really not only 7, in an interesting way by talking about this meme. But it is a strange meme. I hope we can agree about that. So with this example up, let me read a few, and then let's break down what they are. I think that wrath will be a useful one to start with. So let's read, what sin do you relish the most? The customer thinks about it for a sec and then says, wrath, a sin. Squidward responds, how righteous. This part of the meme is like, you sardonically say what the benefit of the sin would be, of the meme would be. So, wrath. What would be one of the benefits of wrath? Sort of. How righteous. But I believe said sarcastically when taken in the context of the format. The customer elaborates about what they feel is good about the meme. My fury is justified. My anger is pure. And then Squidward responds by mocking or kind of deconstructing the sin. Why won't that work, basically? In this case, saying, you wear vengeance like armor, but it corrodes from within. you will become what you aimed to destroy. Let's read one more with the idea that the format is, what sin do you relish the most? You say one of the sins. Then Squidward sardonically presents what you could see as like the surface level benefit of the sin. The customer defends themselves, and then Squidward deconstructs the sin. What a delightful, what are we even doing here, you know? What sin do you relish the most? Greed. How insatiable. I only want what's mine, and theirs, and his, and yours. The more you take, the less you have. You will starve surrounded by gold. Now, that was a little different, wasn't it? The interesting thing, in my opinion, to notice is that the sins are not remotely equal. The sins are not at all equal. If you analyze the 7 or whatever deadly sins, you could argue that there is a very big divide between them. And I think this is reasonable. Maybe someone could make a sort of list with that, and I have. I think that it is interesting to deconstruct the sins with their 2 vectors I think are interesting. The first one is basically how beneficial they are if you annoy, if you don't bother with, if you waive their drawbacks, and how bad they can be. So 2 different ways to rate the sins. I'm going to rate them all now. I've done this before the parlay. How beneficial they can be if you waive their drawbacks, and then how bad they can be, basically. Less bad is better for that one, obviously. And then doing this, we can conclude what the best sin is. Of course, easy, right? Let's do that now. So provide benefits. A lot, moderate, and minimal. And I'll try to explain along the way. And then we're going to come back to the meme, and you can see that for some of the sins, this analysis demonstrates how they fit better or less well into the meme format. For my money, these 4 examples that PistilWhip provided us with, you can see that wrath, envy, and lust follow a pattern, but greed doesn't, and the reason is that greed is a better sin. So I will propose. Let's demonstrate that. Okay, so provide benefits. A lot, moderate, minimal. Again, this is how beneficial can the good part of the sin be if you don't bother with the drawbacks, if you don't worry about the drawbacks. You could view this as we just magically waive the drawbacks, or you could say, like, what if you execute the sin in an intelligent way? A balanced way, you don't have to worry about the consequences for some reason. Whatever you want. A lot of benefits. For me, this is greed and pride. I think greed is beneficial because the main problem with greed is other people. You can be greedy and it can benefit you a lot, but it might cause other people to dislike your greed or see you as being overly focused on your own benefits, for example. But with a properly utilitarian mindset, you could arrive at a position where it would be minimally negative to be greedy, I believe. Pride, similar thing. There are many benefits to taking pride in the things that you do. Obviously, some of these are interpreted differently by, like, the clergy, but I'm interpreting them in a colloquial way, and I don't think it would make sense to spend this entire parlay discussing the, like, religion theory of what each of these sins actually means. You could do that, but here on Parlay, we mostly don't focus on, like, we're just going to spend the entire half hour talking about facts. I'm going to tell you my opinion. And I mean, in reality, when most people are told of the 7 deadly sins, they don't know that stuff. They interpret them as what they think that term means. So I think that still has value. There are many benefits to being prideful of the things that you make. And I would say that to some extent, our society has sort of put people off of being prideful of the things that they make to an extent. However, obviously being prideful to a fault is silly. You know, you can look no further than Daedalus and Icarus for that. Being able to make effective wings, being proud of your constructs to a fault renders you ignorant of their actual effectiveness. Obviously, that's bad. We're not confused why people think greed is bad. Like, we get that. You take what is other people's, and you seem to not be willing to share a beneficial social quality. But there are ways to express pride and greed where they have minimal or zero drawbacks. It's good in life to try to be greedy, to reach for things that give you the most positive benefits. And a way to balance that is just to do it in such a way that other people don't lose things that they have. An enlightened enough perspective will allow you to be greedy without really losing anybody anything. And thus, it is one of the more theoretically beneficial sins. Same thing with pride. As long as you keep it in check and don't just go crazy, there are a lot of benefits to being relatively prideful compared to other sins. If you were 75% prideful, compared to other sins, 75% that sin would be pretty bad, but it's not as bad with pride, or it's more beneficial. Spoiler alert for where pride is going to be in the next ranking. But anyway, sins that provide only moderate benefits. Envy and wrath, by my vote. Envy. You can use this as a way to better yourself. With only a modest amount of envy, you see what is good in other people and try to mimic it in yourself. What sin do you relish the most? Envy. How inspiring. Well, yeah. I see what others have, and I ache to take it for myself. I mean, as long as it doesn't ape their own success, which is basically just greed, I mean, okay. Your gaze lingers too long on others' light. In time, you will forget how to kindle your own. Certainly, it's not good to take envy to excess, but there are many benefits to admiring other people. I mean, admiration sounds good. It's basically just envy taken to a, less of an extreme. And wrath. I mean, being someone who will put your foot down about values you have is not of no value. It's just bad when taken too far. You see what I mean? Moderately beneficial. Minimally beneficial. Sloth, lust, gluttony, and I'm including gloom because it's fun, and Limbus Company acknowledges that greed, the best sin, isn't one of the sins, and it says gloom instead, so let's do gloom. But they're pretty much the same. Sloth and gloom are not that different, yeah. Sloth, lust, gluttony. Sloth. Inaction. Obviously not that beneficial. Lust. It's a very short-lived version of greed, basically. We're going to get into that topic later. But there's not a ton of benefits, you could argue. And there is some hierarchy to the sins, in my opinion, as well. And then gluttony. Again, in some ways, a sort of inferior version of greed. You want a lot, but you want to consume a lot of those things. Again, just because I'm aware it's going to push people's buttons a little bit, I don't intend to. I understand these are loose and colloquial interpretations of each of the sins. That is intentional. I acknowledge that. It's okay if you disagree. I'm just giving a way of analyzing them. I'm not claiming that it's silly to do it any other way or proving that one is the best. That doesn't matter. I don't care about that. I just think it's interesting to analyze them with a certain perspective. And I think that many of the sins are a subset of the better sins, and they're a worse subset. They're the less beneficial version of another sin, you could argue. And I think that that's the case with lust and gluttony. Sloth is rest, but very little rest is actually that beneficial. And I would argue that another angle on this one is provides benefits, well, compared to what people already have. If you were to look at all of current humanity, I would argue that sloth is already a sin that many people are a little over focused on, and so more isn't as beneficial. Maybe that's grading on a curve, but it's hard to remove that perspective. So there you go. Providing benefits if you don't worry about the drawbacks. Greed and pride, great. Envy and wrath, meh. And sloth, lust, gluttony, gloom, maybe not that much. Okay, let's look at them from the perspective of how few drawbacks. When you take the sin to excess, how bad is it, basically? Once again, pride. Yeah, not good. Very dangerous. But only if you take it to extreme excess, only if you're prideful about something to the point of near madness. Otherwise, having a lot of confidence in the thing that you make in some ways adds value to it. People take an interest in why somebody is so interested in this. And certainly, there are many examples in our culture of people who are very proud of something they've made with no real value upon analysis, but this causes people to investigate it and generates value because people investigating and taking an interest in something, thinking about something for themselves, itself provides some kind of value. And so I would argue that while it's not a particularly deep value provided, There aren't very many drawbacks unless you take pride to an almost biblical degree. It's only going to be harmful if you are overly prideful to the point of madness about something that actually does threaten your life. Otherwise, I don't know, you're just sticking to your guns, and maybe this isn't very good, but our society does reward that behavior rather heavily. We're going to get into, okay, but like if you want to be a real guy, that's not actually that good later. But I think it is true that in current real life, pride is not that punishing if you take it to excess. Also, lust. Personally, I feel like the thing about lust is that, like greed, which I consider to be kind of a subset of, lust is, while not as beneficial, also not as harmful. Certainly, it's very bad to, I don't know, like, please respect consent. You know, I'm not trying to say anything like that. Just to say that if you are interested in sexuality, I hardly think that watching a lot of porn is as bad as becoming a criminal. You know, I don't, if you want to formulate it like that. And so, while certainly not that good, maybe it's also not that bad. Remember, lust was at the minimal benefit in the previous ranking, but I would also reckon that it doesn't have a whole lot of drawbacks for many people. You know, it's not always excellent for your personal health. Talk to your doctor and all that, but I think it can be fine. Drawbacks, medium amount of drawbacks. Sloth, gluttony, greed, envy, by my reckoning. Sloth. Yeah, I mean, resting more is good. I would argue it's more bad than good, but the stakes are a little low overall with sloth. Kind of like lust, except that I think lust's benefits arguably slightly outweigh its minimal drawbacks, whereas sloth doesn't have a lot of... Did I just say lust? I meant lust. Sloth, it doesn't have that many benefits or drawbacks. It just doesn't do much. That's like the whole thing. Gluttony. Yeah, I mean, it's consumption. You know, the thing about gluttony is that a lot of the negatives are inherently temporal. You know, you consume to excess, and it can be washed away with a disciplined week following that time of consumption. I don't think this is the end of the world. Greed. Yeah, you know, you have a thing, though. You didn't consume it, like with gluttony. While I think our society is a little bit less favorable when looking upon greed, you can also turn back greed. Just give away the things that you had hoarded. This is the thing you can do. You can be selfish, but then share. And so I think that it's something that's quite mutable. Can you tell I think greed is the best sin overall, even though according to my ranking, it's pride? Envy. Yeah, I do think that people aping on each other is considered bad. Humanity very highly values novelty, so viewing somebody else and becoming good yourself in a way that is focused on others' benefits directly, yes, is seen as bad in our society. But a lot of people just don't know, and when people are original, they're just synthesizing in a more advanced way. So I would argue that's a little unfair to envy, maybe a little bit different than how I'm evaluating the others. It's just that when envy is bad, it's arguably getting a little bit of a bad rap because people don't notice that, like, creative originality is actually fairly envy focused anyway, just in a way that they don't notice as much. So I'm trying to give envy a more fair shake, maybe. Envy got medium both times. And then severe drawbacks, gloom, and then by my reckoning, wrath. Yeah, depression is probably one of the worst of these, but then wrath. I think that wrath taken to excess is very bad. I think this is the one where, you know, greed and envy and pride, these things might be off-putting to your fellows, but wrath is the one that will make you off-putting in a way where people are actually scared of you, if that makes sense. Not just find you unpleasant. And so I would argue that wrath is pretty bad as the negative aspects of sins go. And wrath is also a very action-focused sin. You do things, you mess a lot of stuff up in a way that is very culturally memorable. Unlike something like gluttony, where, yeah, you consume a bunch of things that are destroyed, but once you metabolize and, you know, I don't know, pay for them and stuff, I mean, ain't no thing, you know? Whereas with wrath, it's like you probably destroyed while being wrathful to an extent, burn some bridges, or perhaps literally rather than figuratively. So not that great. With this ranking, pride hashes out as the best. Not a sin I particularly think is important. It's now useful to discuss Why are these considered bad again? A lot of them have very obvious benefits, so like, what's the deal? But I think it's interesting to look at them and see that they're not that equal. And again, going back to the meme format from before, you can see that we have a situation where wrath, envy, and lust here fit the format quite well. They say the sin. Squidward says a bit sardonically, like what you might consider to be the benefit of the sin, and then they defend it. Squidward decries it. But with greed, this is harder to do. You know, there is a way in which greed, you could say the problem is it's focused on wanting, but wanting more and genuinely enjoying all of it is not necessarily bad unless you live in a consumerist society where we live in a dystopia and there's limited resources to go around. I mean, there really aren't limited resources to go around in our current society. We just live in a sort of weird mega bubble point in human history where we do create enough for everybody to be given enough, but we just haven't reorganized it equitably yet, maybe you would say. And so I would argue that greed is only bad due to contrivance in our current society, provided you actually enjoy all the things. Anything taken to madness-inducing excess is bad. But this is one where you could go pretty far, and as long as we organize our society better, it would be like fine, good to behave that way. Again, I would also argue this is a place where many people are not already doing this enough. That is, they don't ask for more from the world around them. Just because there are a few people that do ask for more from the world around them, and they do it in like a stupid way, they short-sightedly want just more money, and they don't want to convert it into amenities, doesn't give this sin a negative knock, in my opinion. And that's kind of the key thing about the sins as a transition point to this next part. I think that for a lot of them, there's a big divide between if you think about doing the sin in an uninformed way versus in, let's call it an optimized or a min-maxed way. When people think of greed, they think of having a lot of money, but that doesn't actually benefit you that much. People just short-sightedly think that it benefits you a lot. If you actually convert all that money into amenities that you genuinely fully enjoy, there aren't a lot of drawbacks to that, and it even auto-corrects for some of the greed, because you won't be able to appreciate that many amenities worth of benefit. If you're actually trying to extract all the value out of life, you're greedy in a meaningful way, in an intelligent way, you simply won't want that much money. You won't be able to use it to convert it into actual benefits. So hoarding is bad, sure. And that's what, your billionaires are doing. That's stupid. And the reason is not because money isn't valuable, but just because that amount of money isn't valuable. And if they were focused on converting it into actual benefits that made them happier, instead of deeply insecure in a way that makes them want to fly a penis rocket to the moon, then they wouldn't want that amount of money. It's just that they're not smart enough to realize that. And I'm sure given enough time, they would realize that. And then they would give all their money away or whatever and get actual amenities out of it. You can see this in that you can't see this. Anybody who followed this philosophy would largely retreat from polite society because it sucks. And so, of course, you can't find any people like this. The first thing they would do is get away from the public and the press as quickly as possible. So you wouldn't know if they did it. There may be very rich people who are just hanging out, having a good time. And one of the first things they would do is make sure you didn't know about it. So from my perspective anyway. So looking at the other sins, you can evaluate, well, if you do them in a smart way, how good is this? Again, you can see how pride can kind of add value to something in theory, and it's just not that bad unless you take it to a ridiculous extreme. Something like lust. You could argue that maybe if you think about it enough, your sexual desire just doesn't matter that much. You can look at lust other ways too. But I mean, there's a you only live once feel to something like lust. I would argue that doing something like extreme sports is lusty in the lust category. Let's read the lust version of the meme. What's in do you relish the most? Lust. How tender. I long for touch to feel alive again. Well put. You seek warmth in a fleeting fire. It will burn you hollow and leave you cold. Certainly, a lot of the people who embrace these kinds of things are quite habitual about them. Yes, I would agree with that critique, but you can see the point of the meme format lust person. I told you we were going to explain the joke to death. Have I beat the dead horse enough? Do we have horse meat mince yet? I think so. I think we're getting there. But for real, I mean, yeah, maybe you need to go seek that thrill over and over again. But if you're okay with doing that, I mean, it's sort of fine. You would argue this is one that doesn't cause that much harm in aggregate. It's just reckless. Maybe you could describe it that way. Same thing with greed, really. Like, it can be bad to just linearly seek a lot of amenities. Like, if you're doing that to compensate for something in your life, that's not going to work. Like, you won't be able to make yourself feel fulfilled. That's, I gather, what the meme format writer is saying, the more you take, the less you have, you will starve surrounded by gold, means. Right, if you look for fulfillment from physical objects, that won't work. But if you, like, aren't an idiot and you are fulfilled in some meaningful way and you focus on fulfillment and you're greedy about fulfillment, actual fulfillment, I would argue that's less clearly bad, is the point I'm trying to make. But there are others, like wrath, where, yeah, you could argue there are positives. It can be beneficial to put your foot down. It can be dangerous, sure. But what is the, like, real benefit of wrath in an enlightened society? If people aren't just, like, shallow and disrespectful, do you need to put your foot down? Do you see where I'm going with this now? There are some of the sins where if you advance society and your own thinking far enough, their benefit kind of goes away or seems relatively more appropriate, even though they may have, like when you break it down, logistically more or less benefits. Some of them are just a kind of immature idea overall in society, or the way society views them is kind of just like, you know, yes, it's not good to try to get fulfillment in your life by seeking to get more and more and more. But if you're at peace with the fact that the nature of existence is transient and you won't be fulfilled by having a giant pile of money, it's not like bad to just make the most of that time. And that is an enlightened version of greed. But I struggle to imagine an enlightened version of wrath. You know, you could say something like, oh, you like calmly try to pass legislation with a lot of determination. But yeah, I get it. That is wrath related. You're angry and you channel that into something productive and nonviolent. I hope we can agree that's pretty far removed from wrath. Most people who are wrathful in a less enlightened way wouldn't really relate to that as being the same behavior, whereas an unenlightened person pursuing greed would enjoy the greed of the enlightened person pursuing greed. It's just better. It's not really something different. It just is more efficient. I think, to me, that is the difference. And it's interesting in this analysis. I've always had a very high opinion of greed as a philosophy, in theory, for all its drawbacks. But it's interesting when you break things down this way, how some things that I had had a higher opinion of in general, like wrath, a relatively higher opinion, folks, okay? And some things that I'd had a lower opinion of, relatively speaking, like lust, actually make very different amounts of sense if you assume a very intelligent actor, if you assume good game theory and the person is kind of trying to do it in a beneficial way. Then suddenly lust makes a lot relatively more sense to pursue, and wrath makes almost zero sense relatively to pursue, even though that in our current society, I would argue wrath is probably usually better than lust. They're all bad, really, but relatively better. So I think that's really interesting. Why are these considered sins? I hope this doesn't seem too basic to other people. I think it's informative in the context of that way of breaking the sins down. You know, I think it's easy to say something like, well, it's the things that the church doesn't want you to do. If the society is, the peasants in the village get their morality or philosophy is really what it is from going to church, what do you want to instill in them as being something that you ought not to pursue? Now, this is really interesting because that means that you're going to tell people things that you think are good values if you do not explain your work. If you don't show your work on this equation, which ones give you a good result? I think that's what's really interesting about the sins. At least when I've gone to congregations in my life, they do not explain why they think these things are bad. And even these explanations are like, I like them for what they are, but they're hardly a thorough breakdown of why in society it would be good or bad to do this thing. That's what I did for the past 29, almost 30 minutes. Why in detail is this a bad thing to do? And why aren't they a detailed breakdown of why this would be bad in context? Because if you do that, some people will disagree, and some of these aren't that bad if you have a better perspective on them. But you probably don't want to assume that people have a better perspective on them. If it's the middle of the night and there's nobody around, is it okay to run a red light? You might be thinking, well, I guess so, but you still might not do it. And why? Well, the reason is that it's not a good maxim. If you have to give it to a general populace without knowing their mental state, you don't want to encourage them to assume that they know better than the safety feature, because it only takes a few of them to wrongly believe they know better for there to be an accident. So it's a good maxim, but it's not universally true. Obviously, if there's absolutely nobody anywhere, it doesn't change anything for you to not stop at the red light, but it's still a good idea to have red lights and tell people to stop at them. Those two things can be good at the same time. And it's the same thing here. It's good advice to tell people not to be wrathful, to not be greedy, for example. But that doesn't mean that it's like bad if you are smart about it to do that. That isn't the topic being discussed when sins are brought up. They're saying, if I can't know anything about you, and I have to hedge my bets, and I can't explain the societal benefits and detriments, yeah, I don't think you should do this. You'd probably be better off if you didn't do that. And indeed, I think that if you take a non-disingenuous view of the 7 or whatever deadly sins from the Bible or whatever text you want them from, this is my level of disinterest in the Bible, sorry. I took a lot of religion studies courses, but this isn't the kind of thing we talked about in them. Yeah, I think that would be good advice for how to live. Doing these things in moderation, being willing to admit that you are imperfect, and it's not some awful thing if you do a little bit of one of these, but that it's good to keep them in check. Yeah, they're human ideas, and that is a helpful way to look at them. You're going to be gluttonous at times. It's a pretty basic human desire. You're going to be greedy. Your survival instincts will make you want to hoard more. You'll be wrathful. Things will make you angry. You'll be ruled by emotion until you develop the counterweighting tool of logic, not to eliminate emotion, but to balance it out and give you multiple options to pick from. We can't assume that you've done that, so you will be wrathful at times. Lust, a straightforward basic human desire. Yeah, as you develop your philosophies more, this might be one of the ones that fades away very quickly, and it will be relatively uninteresting. Lust just may be one of the least sophisticated of these sins, and so it's one that you can kind of like mental engineer out of. But certainly, as a general piece of advice, yeah, it's one you would eminently expect. You could keep going. These are the 7 or whatever things that you don't want people to do to excess. I think that's the more helpful way to think of them. And again, assuming a particularly unprincipled actor, yeah, this is a pretty good list of the about 7 things that like you probably don't want people to take too far in life, don't you think? They're solid overall. Again, you could be more cynical, and I thought about doing that for this parlay. These are the things that the church will find you easier to control if you don't take to excess, and you could take that cynical view of the church. I think that that is not what history supports. I think that people do enjoy having a community that helps them mitigate and mediate their desires, and there is a lot of good done by people confessing their sins in church, and there is a very gray area between how those are treated. You go confess your sins or talk about doing something that's considered a sin, and how do people respond when you tell them about that? Do they accept you for your flaws and tell you to do the best you can to balance them out? Good. Or do they condemn even the slightest humanity? Obviously bad. These flip right back around to being foolishness if you say that it's bad to do any of them. These things are humanity itself. You can't not do any of them. It would be to be a completely different existence, to not be at all wrathful, greedy, envious, lustful, etc. would be to be not human. That's fine, but I mean, it's not very realistic for people we know nothing about. So it seems pretty ineffective to argue that people should like make sure they don't have any of these things. The best person, to put it a different way, would not be a person who was the least wrathful, greedy, envious. Think about people you think well of. Are they people you think well of because they are the least of these things? Or is it good because they have the best version of these things? I would argue it's definitely the latter. Yeah, I hope this isn't too self-centered. If you like the things I make, I would argue I'm definitely not the least of these qualities, the most controlled. It's that I have the most measured control, or more measured control. I definitely don't have the most. If you think that I do a good job at the things that I do, I hope upon analysis it's clear that it's not because I do a good job of eliminating these feelings. It's because I do a good job of understanding them, right? That's what we're doing here, basically. Now, you could do better, of course. Again, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I just think it's a helpful example. Much of Parley is just taking things as they come. We're not going to reject the idea, nor embrace the idea. We're going to balance and digest the idea. That's sort of meant to be the point. That's what I've got for you about the 7 deadly or whatever deadly sins. It is interesting, and we could do a whole parlay more about the, to me, quite fascinating factual detail of condensing them and like what they are considered to be, like biblically, you could say. But I decided not to do that here. I think it's interesting. I just decided not to go into it as much as I could. That is a deep cut about Pope Gregory inventing envy, NVIDIA, and then Shakespeare providing us with envy being a greed-eyed monster, hence the NVIDIA logo. Very deep cut, very nice. But I don't have further to say about it. I just think that's a cool idea. Yeah, it's an interesting subject. I like these kinds of parlay. We get to kind of dig into, here's this thing that people kind of just say all the time without much analysis, and we get to add the analysis. A pretty simple way to do a successful parlay is to just take something that people normally don't show their work when they say, and just, we do show our work when we talk about. And, you know, you could say, I think it is a divide among the audience, perhaps, how you view like the conclusion of this topic. Did you feel like it was worth it to break things down like that? I did. I think that it's a healthier view of human flaws, or the things that make humans human, and worth and value in society. But it's debatable, sure. We end then with one more as a little treat. What sin do you relish the most? Sloth. How restful. I like that one. The world moves too fast. I crave stillness, and I want no part in its frenzy. Your apathy will rot your will. Even the soul needs motion, lest it wither in place. You know, I didn't focus that much on sloth as one because I think it's probably much more obvious why sloth is bad. Maybe that... And again, according to my ranking, sloth is also one of the ones where like there just isn't much benefit to slothfulness. You could say the main thing is, yeah, it's that you rest, that you gain some kind of rest from it. But I would just argue the benefits here are quite minimal compared to the others. So there's not as much to defend. Sloth rated the lowest overall among the sins, tied with, well, I guess gloom technically rated the lowest overall. But again, I would argue that's kind of a subset of sloth. We didn't really get into gloom that much. Anyway, a fun topic. Folks, if you'd like to submit your own parlay like this, you can do that using a link in the description. You can submit whatever you like, short or long, meme format or not. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.